Hi everyone, my name is Daniel Villarreal. I'm a longtime queer journalist, and you are watching the YouTube version of a talk I recently gave at South by Southwest entitled Everybody's Kinda Queer, the Future of LGBTQ Media. The reason I'm recording this is because only about 70 some odd people were able to attend my talk. It was a small room, but there were hundreds of others who had expressed interest in the topic, and so my hope is that by sharing this, lots of people will be able to watch it and talk about it, and we can kind of continue the conversation and have the information out there. I myself, as I said, am a longtime queer journalist. I am also the webmaster at danielvillarrealwrites.com. I currently work for LGBTQ Nation and Queerty.com, but I've also written pieces for Vox and Slate and The Stranger. I've also worked with The Advocate, Out Magazine, and a handful of other LGBTQ publications. I'm founder of Queer Bomb Dallas, which is a Texas-based nonprofit offshoot of the Austin annual queer rights celebration. We're basically a non-corporatized pride event that gets artists and activists to rally together to talk about local queer issues and then to march through a non-queer part of town where we encourage people to participate, don't spectate, and then we have an after celebration where we bring everyone together, lots of local performers, and just have a great time. I'm also the founder of Cinewild Dallas, which is the nation's longest running LGBTQ monthly film series, where we have a pre-show guest talking about the themes of the film, and then we show the movie, and then we have a participatory art event afterwards. You can find both of these on Facebook. Generally speaking, I've been interested a long time in free speech and sexual politics, and I'm also available for hire. So if you like what you see, feel free to contact me and we'll continue the conversation. We're going to cover a lot pretty quickly in this talk. But the title of the talk basically came from the idea that queerness isn't just about sexual orientation or gender identity, but it actually, to me, it has to do with a lot of other overlapping shared human experiences like social policing, oppression, censorship, fashion, representation, marriage, sexual health, self-expression, addiction, just a bunch of other issues that aren't specific to sexual orientation or gender identity. These so-called queer issues affect everyone, whether people realize it or not. And my hope is that if we show and talk about some of these, that we can disintegrate some of the barriers between queer people and straight people and start to engage one another in terms of political activation. As we've seen, media bonds communities together every day, and so when we combine tech with reporting, we can mobilize our communities around key issues to help improve our culture, and that's really why I'm giving the talk. But before we begin, there's been a lot of changes in queer media that are worth bringing up right now. Since 2008, the United States has lost 166 local newspapers. Most of them served as watchdogs for local politics or as broadcast boosters for community efforts. Today, according to longtime queer journalist Trish Bindex, there are fewer than 20 LGBT publications still in existence nationwide. And most of these LGBTQ publications fall under one of two types, either dedicated sites or vertical sites. So dedicated sites are sites that are dedicated almost entirely to LGBTQ news. And these are sites like Queerty, LGBTQ Nation, Toll Road, Hornet, Joe My God, and Autostraddle. Verticals, in comparison, are separate sections within bigger media outlets that cover queer news. So for example, NBC has NBC Out, Huffington Post has Huffington Post Queer Voices, and BuzzFeed has BuzzFeed LGBTQ. But recently, there have been a lot of mass layoffs and changes within a few specific LGBTQ sites. Last fall, Hornet laid off almost all of its full-time editorial team. Grindr's in-house editorial team with Into More recently shut down, laying off its entire staff. BuzzFeed laid off 15% of its staff, including some editors of its LGBTQ vertical, and the Huffington Post laid off 9.5% of its staff. And all of this is enough to make anyone wonder, what the hell is going on? In actuality, it's a few things. Some of these outlets said that the layoff was actually due to financial performance or desire to pivot to video. But a pivot to video is actually a pretty dicey proposition, seeing as that social media algorithms can kind of change on a whim. And so investing in video as a long-term economic strategy isn't really the smartest move because you're putting a lot of eggs into a basket which may well be smashed once Facebook or Instagram decides to deprioritize that sort of content. Similarly, the pay model for media in general is just horrendously broken, and it has been for some time. So thanks to Google and Facebook ads are rarely sold to a direct single publication. These days they're disseminated on networks via micro-targeting that allow advertisers to basically pay pennies per impression to get their ads in front of the eyes of consumers based on their search and online activity. This ends up denying massive amounts of ad revenue to independent LGBTQ publications who can no longer just go to an advertiser and say, hey, why don't you deal with us? It's much more expensive to advertise that way to a specific audience, which may only represent 4 to 10% of the entire US readership. So a lot of advertisers are thinking, no, I'm not going to put money towards that. I would rather just disseminate it over these social networks rather than advertising to just a specific readership. As a result, the ad sales just aren't as lucrative as they used to be, and few media outlets, gay or straight, have figured out how to become profitable. Most rely on freelancers or contract employees who work 40 hours a week but aren't given any sort of benefits. And as a result, many freelancers that I know, even ones who are doing award-winning work, live hand-to-mouth existences, basically one financial hardship away from complete economic disaster. Many people feel that the Trump administration has been great for media because people are consuming and sharing news more than ever. But the business model has been pretty screwed up for a while, and the fact that it's harder and harder to make money or get distribution makes it harder for small independent outlets to compete. And in the social media age, queers are increasingly treated like a small demographic whose dedicated sites aren't really worth advertising on, even though the LGBTQ community represents an estimated $1 trillion in buying power. So I want to start off first by just talking about 5 stories that have always been popular on any LGBTQ outlet I've ever worked for. First, there's thirst, or as I like to call it, man takes off shirt. So that's, anyone being sexy, anything having to do with, porn stars or just people in their underwear, just, sexy dudes. Conservative comeuppance, and that's sex scandals and hypocrisy, especially if it has to do specifically with gay stuff or sex stuff. People love reading about conservatives getting a well-deserved smackdown. Third is celebrity scandals, and that includes saying anything homophobic, coming out, or doing any sort of advocacy. And increasingly, this also includes drag queens, mainly those popularized through RuPaul's Drag Race. And number 4, we have queer histories and firsts. So keep in mind that queer people are erased from textbooks, and if you really want information on queer people, you have to go to a library or a bunch of dedicated sites to find what you can. But we find that the readership is really hungry for this sort of information to respond well to stories that just cover different aspects of queer history that they didn't get from anywhere else. And lastly, any stories covering discrimination, hate crimes, and violence. I sometimes refer to these as literal or legislative gay bashings. Now, all of these things, with the exception of thirst, are useful information because they help us safely navigate and make decisions, or they appeal to our digital appetites for rage and sex. Also, in the cases of 1, 3, 4, and 5, straight media has traditionally ignored these stories, so LGBTQ readers depend on queer media to cover these as possible life-saving information. Now let's move on to 5 topics that never seem to really do well traffic-wise or seem outright toxic to queer editors. The first is aging queer seniors. The attitude is mostly that old people aren't our demographic and they don't buy things, so we don't really need to be marketing towards them. Second, any criticism of Israel. Now, this is basically a political landmine. We've seen that you can't really criticize Israel without being labeled as anti-Semitic, and Tel Aviv has funneled a lot of advertising dollars into making it a gay oasis in the Middle East, and so there's a real reluctance to ruffle any feathers as far as that goes. Third is homeless LGBTQ youth. Fourth is anything having to do with prison reform, immigration, or HIV decriminalization, basically kind of social justice issues regarding incarceration. And then lastly, international politics generally speaking. Now, I want to point out that most of these issues are ignored for several reasons. Foremost, readers feel like they don't relate to them. Either they don't think these issues affect them, or they do care about them, but they're unsure how to actually do anything about them. And second, these stories also tend to be dry and policy-driven, and quite frankly, boring. They're not considered sexy or fun, and they don't often put a human face on the issue, demonstrate how they affect readers, or how readers can engage the issues. And lastly, and most importantly, there's widespread societal prejudice against the people that these stories cover. These issues predominantly affect old people, people of color, and economically disadvantaged people whose life circumstances might make them seem less sympathetic to prejudiced readers. As such, devoting time, resources, and dedicated reporting to all of these are of utmost importance because they really do challenge institutional power and increase our capacity for empathy. And as you'll see, some of these topics end up becoming addressed in the top 10 list that I'm about to present. So before we get into the top 10 topics themselves, I wanted to explain a little bit about how I came to this final list. And most of this list was actually created by observing metrics and cultural trends. Basically, over the last few years, I've seen writers writing about them more and more, and people clicking or commenting or sharing these stories more and more. So they're gaining more cultural and political significance. I have a proven track record as far as figuring out what stories are starting to break. Not only is that a skill that my job requires me to have, but I was writing about trans issues way back in 2010 and have treated political issues surrounding pornography as a legitimate topic pretty much since I started my career, and long before these issues emerged in LGBTQ media on a wider scale. That being said, while I'll provide some statistics to help prove my points here, I won't be mentioning a lot of specific numbers as far as web traffic go, partly because that sort of information is top secret proprietary information that I'm not illegally allowed to divulge. In other cases, my numbers might fall short just because these issues generally are under-researched and underfunded. But I'm confident that my predictions will bear out, and I'm happy to do additional research if anyone cares to invest in that. It's worth saying that some of these items are also admittedly wish list items. For these, I'll try to persuade you as to why they're important and how we can cover them, but I unabashedly have an agenda. My hope is that if we can highlight these 10 numbers and explain why they're going to be emerging topics over the next decade, then we can get more editors and advertisers behind them and help to push for a progressive media agenda to help expand queer rights, sexual health, and other types of speech. Now, my initial ideas aren't really that mind-blowing. They'll hear them and you'll probably think, oh yeah, of course that's going to be a big issue in the next 10 years. But for the further we go into the talk, the more you'll hopefully think, wow, this guy is full of beans. There's like no way that's going to happen. And good. Part of this video is really to challenge your conception of what's possible. And so if you react that way, hopefully it'll at least get you to reconsider some of these issues, and then perhaps you can discuss it with me later on via email, Q&A, whatever. So for each topic, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain how we got to the present moment, kind of contextualize the issue, give you a little bit of history, and then what the future might hold. That is, what future developments you can expect and why. So number one, trans rights and representation. It has been said that the trans rights movement is basically 10 to 20 years behind the gay rights movement. That's becoming increasingly evident as we now see that they're banned from the military, fighting over their rights to public accommodations and to be recognized in government documents and in media, and fighting to end transphobic violence from far-right religious groups. Part of what's happened concurrently is there's been an explosion of trans visibility thanks to celebrities like Chaz Bono, Laverne Cox, and, for better or for worse, Caitlyn Jenner. As more of these celebrities come out, transface, that is the practice of cisgender celebrities playing transgender roles, has become increasingly unacceptable. But trans rights are definitely experiencing a backlash through the Trump administration, and an increasingly loud but small number of lesbian and straight trans exclusionary radical feminists, also known as TERFs, have been trying to argue that trans people are basically encroaching on women's only spaces like bars, locker rooms, and athletic competitions. These TERFs threaten, dox, and out trans people, and are trotted out by conservative news outlets as proof that gay people don't like trans folks. Concurrently, the right are policing where trans people can be through so-called bathroom bills, even though we've all been using the bathroom with trans people for decades, if not centuries. They're accusing trans people of recruiting young children, saying that children choose to be a different gender on a whim, rather than following medical expertise that actually says that trans identity in youth is insistent, persistent, and consistent. And as I said, they're also questioning the right of trans people to be involved in any sorts of sports whatsoever. A lot of these tactics come straight out of the homophobes' playbook. We saw these exact same arguments pretty much used against gay people for decades. But several things are changing to help challenge these trends, and here's why I think it's going to continue to be an emerging issue over the next decade. First off, more kids and more celebrities are coming out as transgender. We have a greater gender variance amongst youth and youth influencers, and social media has enabled trans kids to find each other more quickly and start to get this information online. We're also starting to see a backlash of religious overreach from businesses and individuals who try to deny trans people their rights. Employees and businesses proud of their anti-transgender stances end up experiencing a public backlash. Prisons and detention centers are also coming under greater scrutiny for their continued use of solitary confinement and misgendering when handling trans inmates. Over the next 10 years, we're probably going to see a lot more calling out of these TERFs, the same way that we've seen calling out of racists. And we're going to need to actively go against these TERFs in order to connect them to their hate speech and to generate effective counter speech and social notoriety for their hatred. A couple of writers have told me that when they write about trans exclusionary radical feminists, TERFs will basically go after them, they'll send their followers after them, and if a trans person likes or reshares these images, then their followers will start going after these trans people as well. This is completely unacceptable, and to make them accountable for the actions of their followers, we're going to have to actually start naming and going after these people and just airing them out. Sunshine will be a powerful disinfectant. As we continue to see courts battles around trans rights pop out around the country, we've seen Title IX of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Equality Clause of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution being used as a defense to say that discrimination against trans people is basically gender-based discrimination. Title IX says you can't discriminate on the basis of sex, and the Equality Clause of the 14th Amendment says that laws have to be applied equally to all people regardless of sex or gender. So in the past we've said that sexual orientation and gender identity are inborn characteristics. That is, we were born this way, we can't help it, and therefore we need extra protection whenever we are discriminated against because of us not behaving as our gender is supposed to behave. Right? But as we start to see gender fluidity start to fall upon a spectrum where we have people who are gender neutral or who are non-binary or who say that they're a combination of genders, it becomes harder and harder for us to say that this is an inborn genetic characteristic that we can't help. That is, there starts to be this sort of political identity in addition to there being like an inborn biological identity that we have. So I think in the next 10 years, what we're actually going to start to see is that court battles will be fought around the First Amendment. That is saying that we have a right to express our political selves, our gender identity, and our sexual orientation through how we carry ourselves in the workplace and the public square, and that these laws are invalid basically because they try to hem in how we live our lives, how we conduct our political selves, both in public and in private. So we're probably going to start to see court battles bubble up around that. And finally, I think you'll see trans coverage start to show a greater gender diversity and bodies. That is, often whenever we talk about trans identity and we get images or we get stories around these things, we get people who are adhering to the gender binary. And I think we're going to start to see a lot more kind of gender variance out there for people who are increasingly throwing these gender roles into the toilet. Okay, next, religious rights amendments. So in 1993, there was a federal law that came out after a Supreme Court case that basically said that the government could not make any sort of undue burden on someone practicing their religious rights. The case in question involved a Native American person who took a psychedelic based on the tenets of his faith, and because the psychedelic was banned, it allowed him to get fired from his job, and then he was on record of having a felony with a controlled substance, which made it harder for him to get all sorts of other social help. And so the government basically says, hey, no, the government can't encroach on your ability to express your religious freedom. So this was all fine and well until about 2015 when Indiana passed their own religious freedom rights amendments. These laws were fundamentally different from the 1993 Religious Freedom Rights Amendment on the federal books because they said that anybody could essentially sue anybody else if they felt that their religious rights were being impinged upon. Indiana's law have to be understood in the context of the 2014 Supreme Court Hobby Lobby decision, which basically said that religious rights don't just extend to people, but also to corporations, because as Mitt Romney said, corporations are people too. So while corporations have been instrumental in helping normalize LGBTQ employment rights worldwide, we're now starting to see national business begin to assert their rights to discriminate against employees and customers alike. The right has taken up this cause as a real moneymaker. That is, they lost on the marriage equality issue in 2015, so they've increasingly gone abroad to South America and Africa, organizing conservative churches around opposition to so-called gender ideology and the Western values of homosexuality. These are groups like Alliance Defending Freedom, the Family Research Council, Liberty Council, 1 Million Moms. They're all involved in the anti-LGBTQ fights under the banner of religious freedom. They need money to lobby state, federal, and international legislatures and to support political candidates, to do emails and do all the other dirty work. And so these causes are basically great money makers. They've trotted out these sympathetic victims basically saying that their religious rights are being impeded, and so won't you please give us money, because if you don't, you're next. Religious rights freedom amendments are also great bits of red meat to stick up the cogs of progress. That is, when politicians create religious rights freedom amendments, it gets their voter base super excited. It also allows them to paint themselves as protectors of family values and Christian morality. It wastes the time of local activists, keeping them on the ropes and preventing them from introducing more progressive community initiatives. It divides the voter base because you end up having a lot of liberal voters who are somewhat conflicted, thinking, ooh, I don't know, people should have the right to practice their religion, but you should also be able to buy a cake wherever you want, but ooh, I don't agree. So you end up dividing the liberal base. It also helps conservative governments hide and prevent progress on more important social issues and transparency. Constituents are a lot less likely to get angry over issues like school funding, infrastructure, transportation, if they're busy arguing over whether the local baker should be able to refuse a same-sex couple a cake. American courts are also becoming increasingly theocratic. The Supreme Court of the United States has essentially punted twice on recent cases, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case and Eileen's Flowers and Gifts, which were both sent back to lower courts to examine the presence of anti-religious bias in their public hearings. Though many LGBTQ media sites didn't report on it, the case of Dominique Ray should raise a couple of eyebrows. This was about a Muslim death row inmate who wanted an imam to give him his last rites before he was put to death. The prison said they didn't have an imam, they just had a Christian priest who would gladly do his last rites, but he said his First Amendment rights were being violated because the government was only pushing a Christian theology by providing a Christian priest rather than a Muslim imam to handle his last rites. The Supreme Court essentially said, yeah, no, it doesn't matter, the priest should be good enough, which means that they're willing to offer protections for religious rights, but only for certain religions. Thus, we shouldn't think they'll be any more sympathetic to marginalized queers. Lastly, right-wing conservative organizations are really great about choosing sympathetic Christians and confusing society about why gay people who want a wedding cake can't just go somewhere else. Alliance Defending Freedom in particular tries to portray these people as super sympathetic, where these poor old grandparents are going to lose their life's work and be forced into retirement. And people buy into that. They aren't clear that the law is clear, and that basically by denying a same-sex couple a wedding cake, that they were breaking the law, and they shouldn't just get a pass because they're Christians. A lot of LGBTQ commenters don't get why you can't just go to a different business, even though that's not really an option for people who are poorer or live in smaller communities. So what's the next decade in this issue going to look like? First off, while it's important to watch the courts, we should also remember that they're not everything. In fact, a lot of these religious rights freedom amendments have been squashed by corporations who say that passing them are just bad business. These companies tend to have progressive policies that favor LGBTQ workers and think that states that pass religious freedom rights amendments affect their ability to hire talented LGBTQ identified workers. We've seen this both in the case of Indiana and North Carolina, two state governments that lost hundreds of millions of dollars after passing anti-LGBTQ legislation. Also, individual stories are turning the tide against religious rights freedom amendments. A 2017 PRRI poll found that 70% of Americans favor non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people, including more than one-third who strongly favor them. Overall, 60% of Americans oppose allowing small businesses to refuse service to LGBTQ people on religious grounds. But in order to continue to combat this trend, we're going to need to explain to the LGBTQ and straight community why you can't just go to another store, and why discrimination is discrimination, no matter which group it's directed against. I can imagine that a lot of liberal people never would have asked the civil rights protesters who sat at lunch counters to just go have lunch at a different place. That's not to conflate racism with queerphobia. They're completely different and have their own history, but it's just to point out that discrimination is wrong no matter who it's directed against. I think we'll also see religious leaders start to call out these so-called religious rights amendments. We're increasingly seeing this in the Methodist and Catholic churches, and individual congregations will have to do the work and show that these bigoted amendments don't actually represent the mainstream of loving religious theology. Lastly, there's going to be an increasing push for us to be politically counted. Right now, the US Census doesn't really ask people whether they're LGBTQ identified, and queer people aren't singled out for demographic information and all sorts of other polling. We are a vibrant community and political force, and we want to be counted. The more information we have about us and people who support us, the harder it will be to say that these policies don't affect anyone except for beleaguered Christians. Number 3, racial justice and creators of color. So it used to be that any LGBTQ media coverage of black people centered around issues of HIV, the myth that black people are somehow more homophobic than everyone else, police violence, or sexual fetishization. There's also been a long history of exclusion from gay spaces, gay media, and gay newsrooms. Basically, queer people of color are hired less often in these spaces, and policies have sought to basically keep them invisible or excluded from being an active part of this community. In fact, 2016 data from the American Society of News Editors shows that Hispanic, Black, and Asian women make up less than 8% of the personnel at 433 traditional print and online news publications. Currently, only 24% of journalists are people of color, despite the fact that 40% of the population is actually people of color. Conversely, issues affecting queer people of color have typically been shunned by gay organizations as racial problems, whereas issues of queerphobia against people of color are treated as queer issues by people of color organizations. So it's been hard for queer people of color to find a home or a platform for their issues in either the queer rights movement or the racial justice movement. Luckily, we've seen a change in trend ever since the election of Obama. It seemed like the day after he was elected, basically every newsroom hired a black person to become an anchorman. It was kind of silly, but the diversity was definitely welcome. And with the advent of shows that are increasingly incorporated characters of color or being designed for and by characters of color, such as the Academy Award-winning film Moonlight, the film Crazy Rich Asians, and other examples, we see that there's increasing push to have groundbreaking representations of queer people of color that don't fall into problematic tropes of the past. For all its shortcomings, social media has also allowed queer people of color to have a greater voice in the shapings of these narratives. Now, QPOC users can actively speak to their favorite shows, their favorite brands, their favorite news outlets, and demand greater nuance and better treatment of characters of color, actively helping shape the narrative rather than just always responding to it. Luckily, the problematic coverage of people of color on queer media is starting to change, partly because we have a lot more celebrities of color coming out as queer. People like Janelle Monáe, Janet Mock, Billy Porter, Lee Daniel, and others helping blaze a trail. We're also seeing increasingly diversifying newsrooms, particularly in publications like Teen Vogue, back when they existed, Mike and Into, also Out. So newsrooms are slowly coming around to the idea that we need people of color in order to cover these issues competently. I think we're likely to see a lot more local organizations beginning to call out their newsrooms and queer spaces for not being racially inclusive. Several years back, the Human Rights Commission of Philadelphia conducted a study looking at racist practices in gay bars, and they found a handful had been using racist business practices, like requiring more than one form of identification in order to get into a bar, ignoring customers of color, not hiring or promoting people of color, having racially coded dress codes that didn't allow things like sagging pants, sneakers, or basketball jerseys. Bars and spaces that continue these practices will be called out and covered in our media, and they should be. But this fight will depend on local groups and citizens making people aware that these problems exist in the first place, and uniting with other organizations to help address the issue. It also needs to be said that there's going to be a continued need for white allyship. A really good example of this is Ryan Murphy, the television creator. In 2016, he launched what he called his 50-50 plan, which basically said that he wanted to ensure that half of his show's directors were either women, people of color, or LGBTQ people. And he wanted to recruit other directors and showrunners that had the same goal. This is especially important because female directors right now only make up a quarter or less of all TV directors, with women of color directing less than 6% of any network's shows. Part of the white allyship that we're seeking will also have to come by connecting the dots on these issues for white readers. Not every reader understands why racial discrimination affects them, even if they're not a person of color themselves. And so some writers are going to need to be patient and try to explain how these issues affect them, even when readers think that they don't. Part of getting readers and communities mobilized on these issues will have to involve collaborations with organizations dedicated to people of color and racial justice. As I said earlier in this video, not all readers understand how they can make real change on these issues. And so if editors can start recommending concrete steps that people can take, I think we'll start to see people mobilized around these issues and starting to feel like that their readership makes substantial change. Number 4, drug and sex work legalization. Early on in the gay liberation movement, sexual freedom and bodily autonomy were major goals. The belief was largely that, considering all the other indignities and abuse heaped upon us, we should at least have the right to control what happens with our own bodies. And these rights extended to drug legalization, legalized sex work, and the right for poor displaced queers to have adequate housing, or at least the ability to live on the streets without fear of violence. Drugs and sex work impact our communities in unique ways. Data from the 2015 survey on drug use and health showed that lesbian, bi, and gay adults are twice as likely than heterosexual adults to use illegal drugs, at a rate of 39% to about 17%. A 2015 Urban Institute study showed that homeless LGBTQ youth were 7 to 8 times more likely than heterosexual youth to have participated in sex work. 11% of trans Americans also say they've traded sex for money at some point in their lives, according to a 2015 report conducted by the Red Umbrella Project and the National Center for Transgender Equality. Basically, queer people depend on sex work and drug use in order to cope with the economic disadvantages they're given by society, as well as the pressure of living in an anti-LGBTQ world. And while we dabble in sex and drugs more often than our straight counterparts, we're also more likely to be punished for it. A 2012 study by the Williams Institute showed that lesbian, bisexual, and gay Americans are 3 times more likely to go to jail for drug use than the general US population. and these people are also subject to more sexual and physical assault within prisons than their straight counterparts. Pressure on sex workers has increased following the 2017 passage of SESTA and FOSTA, two bills that prosecute any website found guilty of facilitating sex trafficking or sex work. These bills have caused sex worker forums and service sites to shut down, lest they face prosecution, effectively endangering sex workers who once used them to share professional safety advice. These bills have also caused Tumblr, Facebook, Instagram, Scruff, and Grindr to come up with vague and inconsistently applied policies forbidding any open talk about sex or any images showing nudity or sex. This has effectively harassed erotic artists, sex educators, and body-positive advocates, as well as queer visual historians. While it's true that substance abuse, sexual exploitation, and sex trafficking remain big problems for queer people and the world at large, they're worsened by criminalization because these laws treat them as immoral criminal failings rather than social health issues. Sex workers and harm reduction advocates both agree that sex trafficking and drug addiction would both lessen if they were legalized, regulated, and rehabilitated rather than punished. These days, we even have New York State Democrats and Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris suggesting some form of decriminalized sex work, and almost all the Democratic political candidates support legalizing cannabis. Both are aspects of criminal justice reform, and we can go a lot further. So what can we expect in the future? Well, it should be said that right now religiosity and conservatism in America will make this kind of a hard shift, as America has always been decades behind its European counterparts as far as being sexually open. Sex workers and drug users have been an easy target in this country because they're vilified. But despite the fact that federal law still classifies cannabis as a Schedule I drug with absolutely no medical benefits, which is a lie, by the way, 10 states and the District of Columbia have recreational cannabis, 22 have medical cannabis, and 3 have decriminalized cannabis. More recently, the FDA just approved a ketamine-derived nasal spray for treating depression. So we're already starting to see drug legalization happening on several levels. We're also starting to see better spokespeople on these issues. We've seen ads for pro-cannabis reform featuring veterans, senior citizens, and parents of kids with chronic illnesses. These stories focus on how anti-drug laws hurt marginalized people. Improved reporting on sex work and drug legalization will show how laws have disproportionately hurt queers. They will also examine what, if anything, will be done to recompensate queers imprisoned under non-violent drug and sexual offenses. We can also expect to see more studies on both. Right now we're seeing increased inquiry into psychedelics, namely how MDMA and psychotropic mushrooms affect PTSD. Privately funded studies and groups like the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies are adding data and legitimacy behind legalizing psychedelics for medical use. Now, it's unlikely that we'll see the Human Rights Campaign or GLAAD get behind any of these issues because they're too controversial. But we're also starting to see big and small groups like Amnesty International and Decrim New York raising awareness about these campaigns. Like the cannabis rights movement, they're going to need to find effective spokespeople to help separate reality from myth, like the fact that sex work isn't always exploitation. Porn stars and sexual educators are the obvious first choice for these spokespeople, because many of them have already grown substantial followings on social media by appealing to the internet's appetite for lust. They've long been reduced to their physical appearance and have sprinkled their social media posts with commentary on political issues. As a result, their followings are discovering just how smart, witty, and insightful porn stars and sex workers can be. Eventually, readers and online communities will have to move beyond feel-good collectivism and be willing to do the political drudge work of building organizations, coalitions, taking meetings and leadership positions. But as time continues, I think we'll start to see more politicians and everyday citizens start to come out of the cannabis and sex work closet and start to affirm that legalization is important to them no matter who they are. And in order to make real progress, we're eventually going to need to amend or repeal SESTA FOSTA so that it stops conflating sexual trafficking with sex work. The old law used to make individual posters responsible for the content they uploaded, and by leaving internet developers and internet service providers and company founders on the hook for the content uploaded by other people, they've created a repressive environment that doesn't encourage actual conversation around these issues that affect all of us. Number 5, accessible spaces for disabled LGBTQ people and genderqueer people. Now, before we begin, I want to make clear that my meaning here is not to say that genderqueer identity is a disability, or that being disabled automatically makes you queer. Rather, I've lumped these two together because there seems to be some sort of crossover in the type of discrimination and inaccessibility that both face, as well as the body image issues that seem to undergird both. Disabled and genderqueer people are often treated like afterthoughts and are unwelcome in gay spaces, even though 1 in 5 Americans has a disability, and an increasing number of young people are identifying as trans and genderqueer, according to 2 2017 studies from the University of Michigan and UCLA. There's rarely any coverage of disabled and genderqueer people, and when it exists, it's often written by able-bodied or cisgender journalists who are just trying to convince other readers to sexually desire these people, or at least treat them as actual human beings with feelings. Now, some people say that objectification is the price of entry into queer media, especially since we're primarily defined by our sexual expression. But this objectification is limited and problematic. You see this a lot with the whole body positive movement. Every article about body positivity either features a hunky cis white muscle jockey telling us to love ourselves, or a one-off photo shoot of chubby people of color that's never ever mentioned again. These articles silo and exoticize these communities without really furthering any other agenda or helping organize or create any sort of actionable steps. These articles also push a largely uniform vision of what desirable disabled and genderqueer people look like. We end up with pictures of models and athletes in wheelchairs, or trans people who pass within a binary, or are only wearing fashionable forms of gender-blurred couture. The real root of the problem, unsurprisingly, is that disabled and genderqueer people aren't let in newsrooms. Many can't afford the formal academic training or travel to journalism conferences, and they're largely excluded from gay bars too, both in the visual marketing and in an accessible space to accommodate them. And even when these places are accessible, and most of them aren't, they're also not emotionally accessible. That is, disabled and genderqueer people are often treated as burdens. Their existence isn't accommodated or valued in these spaces. People in these spaces resent them for existing, and we expect these people to do all the labor to make sure that they're included. This is especially true for gay bars, which haven't exactly been welcoming to genderqueer people. Many trans folks feel more welcome in lesbian spaces, and even those spaces are disappearing more quickly than gay bars, for a variety of reasons which we'll get into soon. I want to be clear here, this is a problem with the world, not just the LGBTQ community. Our media and social spaces aren't nearly as inclusive as we'd like to think, and businesses see little profit motive in acknowledging these groups. I actually think that part of this bodily discrimination and ageism in our community has partly to do with the fact that many genderqueer and older queer people who would be disabled by this point in time died out during the HIV epidemic, so they haven't been as visible as they might have been had they lived. We'll likely need a grassroots movement to create any real change on body diversity and accessibility, but I want to explain why I think it will emerge as a growth issue in the next few years. Foremost, everybody has a stake in these issues. If you don't have a disability now, you're allowed earbuds, the ravages of age and disease, and random chance guarantee that you're going to have a physical or intellectual disability at some point in the future. As for genderqueer people, they're not going anywhere. In fact, they're increasing. A 2016 study of 13 to 20-year-olds found that 53% know somebody who uses gender-neutral pronouns. They're pegging each other, wearing unisex clothing, doing drag, and increasingly throwing gender roles into the toilet. The rise of trans and genderqueer youth will continue to normalize, especially as we get more medical and societal data quantifying their numbers and their needs. We've seen a rise of genderqueer influencers in social media. Some of them are hawking makeup for brands like Maybelline. And the success of RuPaul's Drag Race has contributed to this as well, as we now have over 100 gender-bending ambassadors whose marketing and fandom skews increasingly towards preteens and parents. I want to stress that I understand that genderqueer identity isn't the same as drag. I'm merely saying that the show contributes to a younger generation of people throwing out old gender stereotypes. Concurrently, we're going to see a rise in genderqueer fashion. In fact, we've already seen this from retailers like H&M and Zara, and from red carpets. It's true, runway couture has long played with gender presentation, but celebrities like Billy Porter and Janelle Monáe have recently rocked gender-bending red carpet style at awards shows. Even Jonathan Van Ness in Queer Eye suggested that male shoppers go into the women's section if they wanted to find things that were more fashionable for them. Talking about red carpets, you may have noticed at the last Oscars that Selma Blair was there rocking a cane. She's not queer, but her presence highlighted the need for celebrity advocacy. To this end, deaf, sexually fluid model Nile DeMarco has been helpful for raising awareness too. But more able-bodied and disabled celebrities could certainly help. I predict that sometime in the next few years we'll see the emergence of a movement dedicated to advocating for disabled inclusion in gay spaces. Groups that fundraise and call out businesses that don't provide emotional accessibility to our disabled counterparts. I honestly believe that disabled access will emerge as a type of cutting-edge wokeness and radical inclusivity. It'll be cool to be kind, and there'll be increasing cultural cachet around people and businesses that highlight genderqueer people, people with disabilities, and people with invisible disabilities like chronic illnesses. We've already started to see some integration of genderqueer people with the Instagrammers and influencers that I mentioned, Matter of Pride Wrestling, which features trans and genderqueer athletes, the work of Andrew Gurza, who has long advocated for making sexual spaces more accessible for disabled people, and Drag Syndrome, a touring London-based show featuring performers with intellectual disabilities. As newsreaders and community members push for businesses to be more inclusive of disabled and genderqueer people, these businesses are also going to need to do their part by helping recruit disabled and genderqueer employees and incorporate inclusive policies, including healthcare, accessible bathrooms, and education and awareness around discrimination and serving these communities. Number 6. Expanding bisexuality. So even though it's been said that the B of LGBTQ is the largest part of the LGBTQ community, bisexual media for and by bisexuals has never really actually been a thing. The earliest gay publications like One and Physique Pictorial and the latter were mostly focused on navigating the social realities of same-sex attraction, and although many acknowledge the likelihood that their gay and lesbian readers might be married to a different sex partner, I don't think that they equated this with the same thing as bisexuality as we currently understand it. As a result, American media hasn't really known how to discuss bisexuality, leaving us with these sort of biphobic depictions of switchblade bisexuals, dastardly, deceptive, scheming, dishonest, socially deviant, and sexually insatiable. Or they present bisexuality as a sort of rock star lifestyle and the kind of David Bowie extraterrestrial, mind-blowing kind of trope. It's pretty biphobic, and it doesn't really reflect the reality. These biphobic tropes have been continued by mostly gay male editors. Not being bi themselves, they don't really have much motivation to explore this community's issues in nuanced ways. Furthermore, bisexuality can be seen as challenging because bisexuality is so fluid. Many people who exhibit attraction to more than one gender don't self-identify as bi, and bi people are often rendered invisible whenever they date a partner or partners whose gender is different from their own. These days, gay media has largely moved on from the biphobic stereotypes of the past, thank God, but even contemporary bi coverage remains pretty limited to just bisexual celebrities and health disparities. Here's how I think we'll be approaching the issue in the years to come. First off, there's enormous growth potential in this field, because even though a 2011 Williams Institute study showed that 1.8% of American adults self-identify as bi, that same survey showed that 11% of Americans said that they felt some sort of attraction towards a same-sex person, and 8.2% said they actually had sex with a same-sex partner. In short, there's a heck of a lot more bi people around, even if they don't self-identify that way. And this is interesting because it shows the limitation of labels when discussing sexuality in the first place. So recent sociological research has found that we have a bunch of self-identified straight men basically having sex with other dudes, but then calling themselves things like goys or androphiles or heteroflexible, just so they don't have to apply a label that's too gay. A label that would get them discriminated against. Heterosexual privilege is real, y'all. It's important to remember that sexuality as a fixed identity is a relatively new concept, only developed by psychologists and sociologists around the turn of the 19th century. Animal behaviorists actually hate using terms like gay, straight, or bisexual to define animals because animal behavior is fluid and changing, and that includes humans. Instead of saying a penguin is gay, they'll simply say a penguin has a same-sex mate for the time being, because at some other point it could end up having a different sex mate, and that's okay. But despite this inherent fluidity, bisexuality is still fetishized, even so much to the extent that pop stars are viewed suspiciously when they come out as sexually fluid or pansexual or omnisexual. Even so, more and more young people are talking openly about their sexual fluidity. A 2016 study found that only 48% of 13 to 20-year-olds identify as exclusively heterosexual. And as they and other celebrities continue to discuss their bisexuality openly, we're going to see two things. First, we're going to start to see a multiplicity of terms that describe different types of sexuality. Words like autosexual, sapiosexual, gray sexual, demisexual, and these are all terms that describe not who we love, but how we love. Second, I think we're going to start to see a lot more normalization of different sexual identities within the gay, lesbian, and straight communities. This normalization will be aided by bisexual writers and editors pursuing personal profiles about how bi people navigate their identities, how they have to repeatedly come out over and over again, dealing with discrimination in queer and straight spaces, and learning how to embody their sexuality in authentic and unique ways. As with many of the other issues in this talk, progress here really starts with hiring bisexual editors and bisexual writers from intersectional backgrounds and helping build relationships with bi-celebs and bi-organizations for better coverage. Okay, so this next one is kind of a wish list item, but I think that there's some real potential here, and I'll lay out my case. Number 7, the queer sexual revolution. So, back in 2003, anti-sodomy laws around the United States were knocked down by the US Supreme Court, and yet they still remain on the books in several states. Other states have vague laws against indecency and lewdness that allow police to criminalize sex workers, gay sex spaces, and homeless queer youth. In addition to that, 7 US states have what are called no promo homo laws that basically forbid schools from discussing queer issues in any sort of positive light. That means that queer people are basically erased from textbooks, and that LGBTQ inclusive sex education remains an impossibility in these states. It's no coincidence that these 7 states also have some of the highest HIV rates in the entire country. Meanwhile, SESTA and FOSTA, the anti-sex trafficking bill that we described earlier, has caused sex educators to close up shop on social forums like Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and elsewhere. These social networks have also gone a step further by forbidding any advertising that focuses on sexual pleasure. Facebook actually has policies forbidding people from explicitly mentioning their own sex lives. Now, we still have continued access to pornography, for the time being. The UK just passed a law saying that anyone who wants to access pornography has to enter in basically driver's license information to prove that they're actually above the age of 18. But we're also starting to see advertising around PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylactics, a medication that when taken daily can greatly reduce your chance of catching HIV. PrEP isn't just being marketed to gay men anymore, it's being marketed to women of color, transgender women, and other viewers who watch mainstream cable networks like VH1. There's also been a renewed push in public schools for LGBTQ inclusive social studies classes and history classes. New Jersey just passed a law ensuring that age-appropriate LGBTQ content will be integrated into social studies and histories classes. And this will likely continue as younger people begin questioning why none of their textbooks explicitly mention LGBTQ anything. It seems the case in American culture that we always go 2 steps forward for queer equality and then we go 1 step back. The most recent 2 steps forward happened during the Obama administration, and now we're going 1 step back with the Trump administration. So when we talk about a queer sexual revolution, I want to make sure that people understand that this probably isn't going to happen all at once. I don't think we're going to be able to point to one instance and say, ah, yeah, that's where it happened. Rather, I think we're going to have to be attuned to small changes in culture that let us know that this sort of progress is being made. Foremost, we're really going to need the Human Rights Campaign and other state, national, and local LGBT groups to fight against these no promo homo laws by connecting the issue to free speech and making a persuasive argument that erasing queer identities and services makes queer people more subject to violence and self-harm. I also think that we'll start to see a major player start to advertise itself as the place for comprehensive, age-appropriate sexual educational materials. The Universalist Unitarian Church already offers this sort of curriculum. It's just waiting to be monetized by a larger investor. Lastly, as more and more young people are sexting, we're eventually going to enter a time where most celebrities and politicians already have sexual pics of themselves out there on the internet, helping normalize them and helping remove public stigma around that and sex work. In fact, longtime sex columnist Dan Savage has recommended that everyone just publish their own sex pics so we completely erase the stigma around them, although we're still waiting on him to publish his. We might also see a push towards reform on the sex offender registry. Now, this is a more controversial opinion, but right now we have about 900,000 Americans on the sex offender registry list, and sometimes they're placed on there for relatively minor things like publicly urinating, streaking, sharing nude selfies as a minor, or even hugging another person without their consent. The sex offender registry pushes these 900,000 people and their families into unemployment, homelessness, social harassment, and exile. This perpetual punishment may well be unconstitutional and may not actually reduce any sexual offenses or the rehabilitation of offenders. Number 8, building spaces for queer women. So gay bars have already been in decline for a really long time. Because of increased queer acceptance, LGBTQ people now have more places to hang out in society with their families, friends, and coworkers. And if you're sober, or if you're not into loud music, dancing, drag queens, karaoke, late nights, or cruising, there's not really much for you in the gay bar space. They're not really these places for political organizing that they were back in the earlier parts of the gay rights movement. Gay bars in particular can seem pretty inhospitable to lesbian, bisexual, and trans people, as well as women, undocumented people, the poor, the disabled, and people of color. Some of these groups have even reported sexual harassment or assault in gay spaces, making them feel even more unsafe. But queer women are often shot by both sides. That is, straight women don't see them as real women, and gay men don't really see them as queer. So it's been really hard for queer women to gain footing in any space. With declining lesbian spaces, the number of lesbian media outlets is also shrinking too. The long-running lesbian celebrity site After Ellen has more or less been turned into a turf hideout. Other lesbian sites have shut down. And other mainstream LGBTQ sites don't run any lesbian content either, outside of the occasional celebrity coming out. Meanwhile, the lesbian site Autostraddle still struggles to get advertisers to pour money into their market, despite the fact that lesbians represent about $155 billion worth of American purchasing power. Lesbian content is more than just celebrities, Subarus, and scissoring. Lesbian culture also has an interest in crafting, astrology, self-care, entertainment, fashion, and other things that only women in that community are really geared to speak about. But the lesbian coverage we have continues to exclude butch and transmasculine people, instead focusing on lipstick lesbians and subtle butches, basically rendering these other groups invisible. With the disappearance of women's-only queer spaces, we're starting to see some women step up and create their own venues. Locally, there have been community organizational and vending fairs, burlesque performances, and meetups at other bars. One bar in DC, Pitchers, has even set up its own women's-only space called A League of Her Own, with its own management and events to help foster relationships between queer men and queer women partying side by side. Concurrently, we've also seen a push to make bars and music venues safe for queer women of all sorts. Safe Bars DC is one such local initiative, offering training to bar staff to recognize, prevent, and respond to sexual harassment in their spaces. Initiatives like this can breathe new female life into male-dominated spaces. As for media for queer women, there's a huge investment opportunity. There's over 11 million queer women in the United States alone, and a 2015 study found that gay women earn about 9% more than their heterosexual counterparts. A 2016 LGBTQ marketing study found that queer women consciously buy from brands that market to them, and lesbian and bisexual women spend more than their male counterparts on salon services, spa treatments, concerts. They spend more on new clothing, eating at restaurants, and own pets more often too. And yet almost every lesbian site has struggled to get any advertisers to pour serious dollars into their sites, even though there's literal billions to be made and lesbian women are hungry for representation. Talking about representation, you've likely heard that queer women are hella excited about the new L Word reboot, which is supposed to premiere on Showtime sometime in 2019. The series will likely do gangbusters because of the dearth of content for lesbian and bi women specifically. According to GLAAD's most recent report on LGBTQ representation in TV, almost no shows were specifically directed towards queer women at all. As such, there's a huge growth opportunity here, especially for shows that highlight queer female performers. For example, as RuPaul's Drag Race enters its 11th season, there has yet to be a show dedicated solely to drag kings, even though it's a thriving community that totally exists. Anyone willing to spearhead and market for such a show or such a demographic will end up a big winner because there's already a pre-made audience hungering for it. Number 9. Polyamorous families and single people's rights. Before the gay marriage movement, the gay liberation movement was more interested in developing autonomy or alternative family structures that bucked heteronormative notions of family. These included autonomous asexuals, unmarried cohabiting domestic couples, multi-family homes, communes, and even close-knit tribal-style communities where people chose their own family members. These ideas got lost during the same-sex marriage movement, which largely hid away any polyamorous people who didn't want to marry in order to present an unthreatening, desexualized, sanitary vision that made heterosexual Americans feel comfortable with gay love. And yet, the last US Census reported that 110.6 million Americans over the age of 18 remain unmarried. That's 45.2% of the adult American population. A 2014 study estimated anywhere between 1.2 million and 9.8 million Americans in some sort of non-monogamous arrangement. That's up to 3% of the entire US population. And all of these single and polyamorous people are unable to access the 1,049 federal benefits and other privileges related to marriage, including leaving Social Security or military benefits to whomever you choose after death, being able to adopt or get housing, whether you're single or cohabitating, or paying lower costs and premiums for health insurance. About half of US states actually allow for discrimination in housing based on whether or not you're married. And society in general treats unmarried and polyamorous people like emotionally defective social deviants. I suspect we won't likely see any movement on this issue until there's a specific rights movement where people are putting forth solid policy proposals and building coalitions around it. Momentum could occur if the media starts to cover any number of lawsuits that show children and vulnerable people being harmed by policies that favor marriage. But even so, these stories will need to connect the dots to show the unfairness of these policies to their harmful outcomes, using sympathetic victims like children, widows, veterans, especially poor or elderly ones. Political coalitions could unify around certain issues, including single-payer health care, expanding domestic partner benefits, and challenging legal precedents that favor single-family homes. The media could also draw attention to positive depictions of empowered single and polyamorous families. It'd be truly revolutionary to show a polyamorous home or a single person that isn't struggling with some sort of internal dysfunction or secretly longing to find that one true soulmate. Number 10. How LGBTQ communities thrive in repressive regimes. It's sort of a truism that American readers largely don't care about international issues. Some editors have told me that these are largely because American readers are somewhat selfish and xenophobic. They don't feel like these stories really relate to them. And yet, with the 2014 Sochi Olympics in Russia, there was a newfound interest in LGBTQ policies there. This interest centered on gay athletes, how they would respond to Russia's anti-gay laws, and the larger policies of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Since then, we've seen readers generally responding to any stories about outspoken pro or anti-LGBTQ world leaders. And yet a majority of reporting by American LGBTQ media on international governments remains fairly xenophobic. A Russian reader once told me, "Wow, you guys act like any gay person who goes out in the streets is automatically going to have their throat slit by Vladimir Putin himself." He said, "There are a bunch of us out here, you know. There are gay bars, we have gay lives, there are groups, there are performance venues, like there's an entire gay culture out here that no one ever bothers reporting on." Part of this problem comes from the fact that there are very few international reporters working for LGBTQ media outlets to begin with. Good international stories require time, financial resources, and embedded journalists, things that most media outlets just can't cover. Being a native reporter in a repressive anti-LGBTQ country comes with its own risks. Police regularly surveil social media and hookup apps, as well as queer spaces. There's rampant censorship in media, police raids and violence for charges like indecency, prostitution, and drugs. You can have your name and address published in the press, and other repressive governments refuse to acknowledge the existence of LGBT groups, making it harder for them to fundraise or meet in public. 55 foreign countries forbid LGBTQ groups from organizing at all, and an additional 30 have no national LGBT groups whatsoever. But despite the efforts of American LGBTQ media to push for equality agendas in these other countries, natives in these countries don't necessarily want Western journalists articulating their views and their desires. It comes off as imperialist and prescriptive. Many Western outlets will push for things like coming out, pride parades, or same-sex marriage, when people in these countries are much more interested about fostering community and figuring out how to safely coordinate with one another, rather than pushing for a westernized agenda. As American media outlets begin to recognize just how important a role they can play in foreign countries, I think we'll start to see these publications start to diversify their content, both in terms of languages and embedded reporters in other countries. Hornet did a great job of this. During my time there, they were publishing stories in multiple languages like German, Chinese, French, Russian. American media outlets would do well to partner up with anonymous local advocates to help get important information out as soon as it happens, and a better holistic view of how culture does or does not thrive in these regions. As I said, hiring citizen journalists can be a dangerous affair, so media outlets will have to do their best to ensure their anonymity and safety as they continue working together. We'll likely find newfound coverage and interest, not just on the anti-LGBTQ policies happening in these countries, but in how these communities continue to thrive outside of those policies by creating their own meeting spaces, their own publications, their own online venues, and celebrating and living their lives in face of such opposition. I actually think American readers are interested in international stories. They just want a human face put to it, and they're tired of reading the same doom and gloom stories that we get all the time. That's not to minimize the genuine suffering that's occurring in these countries. It's merely to say that we have an appetite to see how these communities thrive authentically and uniquely despite these conditions. Queerness doesn't look the same or mean the same thing in other countries, and so we're hungry to see representations of what this actually looks like and see what we can learn and how we can be better allies to these countries, while letting them speak for themselves. Before I wrap up this video, I just want to give a sincere thanks to all of the LGBTQ journalists who spoke with me when I was preparing this talk for South by Southwest. All of these people are hard-working journalists who are currently in the field and whose work is worth checking out. So I encourage you, please drop by, say hello. Without them, this talk wouldn't have been as informed as it is. And I also invite you to hit me up. I'm really interested in all of the things that we just discussed and a heck of a lot more. As I said, some of these ideas are under-researched or underfunded, and I'd be happy to talk to you in depth about what I can do to help pursue these or shed light on other LGBTQ issues that you might not know about, and to figure out how we can work together to make for a more progressive and inclusive world. But for now, I'll say goodbye, and thanks so much for taking the time to listen. Take care.